Hello and welcome back to the Stronghold. I'm the Magi, and today we are going to be talking about the all-important budget tier list. And no, this is not a pitch for you to pledge on my Patreon. In fact, it's kind of the exact opposite. Although I do distribute my spreadsheet through my Patreon page, it is not behind a paywall because I know all Magic players somewhere in their little Timmy hearts love to build decks. And I think it's very important to have good information so that you can take your resources for Arena and apply them in the best way possible. And while I do believe my Patreon is just chock full of value, I don't want to put something like this behind a paywall. It is absolutely available to even the free level members. So be sure to check that out. So I'm always working on improving these free resources for the community, and some recent changes would be the inclusion of more non-standard decks because, of course, Alchemy is a thing, the Eternal formats are a thing, and Brawl and Standard Brawl, all things. And depending upon how you spend your primary time, whether it's standard or not, it's always good to have a secondary outlet because, standard gets stale sometimes. Other recent updates include hyperlinks from the decks directly to the content, talking about it, or deck lists. And I have most recently added my thoughts on the spreadsheet regarding the upcoming fall rotation. Yes, I know it's 6 months away, but it's never too early to have that in mind when you're talking about putting your resources into a deck list. I've also included my thoughts on what I think is going to be included as archetypes for the next iteration of starter decks. So maybe you don't want to put your resources into a deck that you might end up getting for free anyway, as well as what I think decks might be missing, etc., etc. All out there 100% for free. Perhaps even more importantly, there are some things that you are not going to see around here. One of which is I don't do zero rare decks. Aside from Pauper and Artisan, there really is no honor or benefit in building a deck with zero rares just so you can splash it into a title or thumbnail. Everyone starts with somewhere like 60 to 90 playable rares on day one, and ignoring those resources, in my opinion, is just as bad as spending your wildcards all willy-nilly on somebody's deck of the day. So we don't do that here. Similarly, there is no magic number of acceptable wildcards. I see 5 thrown around by a lot of folks. I'm not going to show you a deck that only has 5 wild cards if it needs 8 or 10 or whatever. I show you decks that are solid starting points for interesting, budget-friendly decks. I help you decide how to spend your resources and then let you make the decisions. There are a number of factors that I consider when I'm evaluating these decks. Of course, first and foremost is how playable is the deck. Because if it's not going to help you grind out those daily wins, it's probably not an ideal candidate. Secondly, how much support does this deck get from things like your starter decks, your jump-in resources, and just following the plan? Next up, a deck needs to be timely, whether that is about those resources and how likely you are to continue collecting those resources, or is the deck due for a ban, or maybe it's coming up on its rotation. And of course, formats play a factor as well. If a deck is likely to do something in a non-standard format, whether that is Alchemy, Eternal formats, or one of the Brawl bases, it's good to have flexible deck concepts. One thing you'll notice that isn't here is how fun a deck is, because fun is a very subjective thing, and I'm not here to tell you the quote-unquote right way to have fun. You're going to need to figure that out for yourself. When I'm doing evaluations, I like to use what I lovingly refer to as the Eastwood rating system, breaking your choices down into 3 easy categories: the good, the bad, and the ugly. Good decks are just that. These are what represent your best daily grinder decks and the best places for you to invest your resources to get the optimal result to effort ratios. These decks tend to be a full standard deviation mathematically above the moving average of all the decks that we're looking at. Bad decks, on the other hand, tend to be a little more tongue-in-cheek as far as the naming convention. These decks are, in fact, centered around that moving average of all the other decks. And despite what the name might imply, these decks are still perfectly playable. I just wouldn't necessarily recommend putting a lot of resources into these decks because they're just not as well positioned as the good right now. But of course, as card pools and metas change, these could very easily shift up or down the spectrum. And finally, ugly decks are sadly just that. Although these might have been in-season darlings, they just didn't pan out the way they wanted to, and it's not really worth investing resources into these decks. But if you already have them and enjoy them, there's really no harm in playing these existing decks. They just don't seem to have a pathway to move out of this particular category, although from time to time, you might see one of these move up. Now, before we get into the individual deck discussions, I do want to take just a moment and acknowledge the seasonal aspects of the Arena budget year. As I'm sure you're aware, Outlaws of Thunder Junction is the 4th and final standard release of this expected budget year. And that being said, that often means that for more established budget or free-to-play players, you already have enough decks built to complete your daily grinds and things like that. And it may make more sense for you to continue gathering and not utilizing resources. For instance, the 4th set of the year is often a good time to gather packs, but not open them until after the new starter decks are released in the summer months. And with the summer push this year, that could be as early as mid-June, and arguably even earlier. So you might not need to build decks at the moment, but it's still good to know what our goals are in the long run, even if you're not actively working on them at the moment. All right, so now that we've got the premise and the process established, I want to start talking about specific decks. And there's 3 in particular that I want to draw special attention to because, well, frankly, there's just not enough people playing these decks. And the data set that I use for analysis is much smaller than it usually is. The first, of course, is the mono blue control deck that I have talked about very, very often. This deck has kind of gotten hated out of the general Arena players, mostly because of the land that makes creatures uncounterable. Honestly, I think this is an overreaction. Our version of the deck was never really about countering specifically creatures. And with new modal blue instants, as well as the spree mechanic, this deck has only gotten better. In fact, from the limited data set that I have been able to garner, mostly from my personal play and some colleagues that I share data with, this is actually up about 1.5 points on win rate. And, well, that's pretty darn good. Next up in the conversation is the Insidious Roots deck. I'm sure you all remember just a couple of months back, this deck was all the rage, and every single content creator couldn't wait to make their version of it. But the fact is, the deck is a little too slow, a little too inconsistent to be competitive in today's meta that is defined by things like Boros, aggro, convoke tokens, whatever you want to call the deck. Those things are just a little too fast and a little more consistent than things like Insidious Roots. However, for us budget players that are just looking to grind through our dailies and not necessarily climb in rank, this is still a powerhouse deck. And we just got a bunch of new plants brought into us as creatures from Outlaws that deserve to be tested in this deck. And I think it's still very good. I think potentially, depending upon what they do with the starter decks next year, this could only be getting better moving into next year. There's also some conversation out there for a potential ban, like they did last year, to kind of keep standard fresh. Hadi Jin is arguably in that conversation, plus a potential key piece to the Boros decks. So there's a lot of things that could shift here. Similarly, in deck construction, we've got the Glissa Sunslayer standard Brawl deck. It is an absolute beast and a powerhouse. It's started out as the best standard Brawl deck you could play this budget year, and it's only gotten better with additional cards like Insidious Roots and other great commons and uncommons that either directly or indirectly contribute to its game plan. If you haven't checked out these decks, I highly recommend at least looking at the list, comparing it to your collections, and seeing if these might be a gem in the rough for you. Alright, so now let's take a moment and talk about the elephant in the room, which actually in this instance happens to be a bird and not an elephant. That's right, Slick Shot Show Off, rare from Outlaws. I'm sure everybody has seen this. If they haven't already added it to their collection, they have probably seen it in an opponent's deck at some point. But the deal here is this has made Prowess cool again. While Slick Shot doesn't actually have Prowess, it functionally does. In fact, in some cases, you could say that this is better than Prowess. It, along with Fugitive Codebreaker and, of course, our old friend Monastery Swiftspear, and several other pseudo-Prowess things have really made this the predominant mono-red deck. Also shows up in certain Boros builds, things like that. There's a lot of experimentation going on. I think there is also a case to be made for some sort of Is It spell deck built around this as well. That having been said, I don't think it's a great time to craft your slick shots. Like we said earlier, at this point, you really should have all the decks you need to finish grinding for this year. And not knowing what's going to be in those new starter decks in just a few weeks makes this a questionable use for a wild card. In fact, I think there is a really solid case to be made that either Slick Shot or Codebreaker is going to show up in one of the decks. And really, depending upon how they address Is It as well as Boros, there is a really good argument once again that we might actually see both of these, but I'm not holding my breath on that. I think Prowess is very real. It's a meta deck right now. I just don't know that it's the best time for you and I to be investing in it. We will probably be better served to see how time plays out here over the next couple weeks. Well then, so what is good? Well, we talked about the mono blue control. We talked about the mono red / off color Prowess potential. But there's 3 decks this season that have really kind of shown themselves to be a little more than we had originally expected them to be. Of course, the Boros Humans budget deck is a very solid player. The Artifact Pirate deck has proven itself pretty solidly and even has some functionality in other formats beyond Standard. And of course, Rakdos aggro / Outlaws with the solid removal package is still holding its own with a win rate over 55%. We talked about the Gleesa Sunslayer deck as well. And our old friend Alchemy Life Gain is still out there. It's an extremely new player, budget-friendly option. And of course, mono white or blue white soldiers is still holding strong with a nearly 58% win rate, depending upon which versions of the deck you're looking at. But I think in the long term, the white-red Boros version is the superior deck. I'm certain that you noticed there was not a lot of new talking points there in the good decks. Again, that's a function of seasonality. We have a pretty good idea of what standard and other formats look like at this point. There's not a lot of room for speculation, etc., etc. But of course, we've got to talk about some bad decks too, because they are in fact still very playable. This season, I wanted to talk a little bit more about that Captain Storm Brawl deck. The blue-green cookies deck is still kind of a powerhouse and very budget-friendly. It's a little underperforming, but I think with a 54% win rate and its budget friendliness, this is probably an issue of people not familiar with the deck trying to pilot it. And I think there's a lot of room for potential upswing there. Also, the just introduced Alchemy Heist is extremely interesting. Its recently completed midweek Magic event shows a lot of promise there. And I think this might very well replace the Dimir Toxic deck as one of the more budget-friendly alchemy options out there for people that are looking to expand their collection a little bit in that direction. Similarly, the new Freedom Mount card is kind of giving new breath to a white-black Blink deck. And really, this is reminiscent of a Blink deck that we did back when Dominaria United first came out. I don't know if you guys were around then, but if you recall, there was a Defenders deck that interacted very, very nicely with Blink. This time around, it's a little bit more value-oriented with enters the battlefield, etc., etc. Of course, the Be My +1 is somewhat evolving into a mounts and +1/+1 counters deck. Really, that's going to come down to, in long run, what they do with the starters next season. The red-green Gruul Dino Power we recently visited in an On the Edge midweek Magic. It's only pulling about 52% right now, but with so many new Powers Matter cards having been introduced recently with Outlaws, I think there's a lot of room for that to come up. And of course, our old friends Mono Red Artifacts from like 2 years ago is still a very viable deck, pushing an almost 60% win rate. And of course, the white-black alchemy interest concepts built around the Legion, still fairly viable out there as well. So, hey, which of these decks are you interested in? Which ones are you already running and having success with? Which are my absolutely crazy for even mentioning? Drop me a comment down below. Let me know what you think. Everybody's opinion matters and is relevant, and there's no reason not to share with the community because, of course, as always, we are stronger together. And before we go, I want to take just a moment to thank my totally awesome patrons for supporting me and allowing me to apply my passion into a community. And of course, before we go, I've got some suggestions for your next step.